Imagine a person running straight at 10 copies, without the slightest hesitation, not slowing down, without a single shadow of fear on their face. This is not bravery as we usually understand it. This is something deeper, more sinister. This is a person who long ago stopped fearing death, because they spent years preparing themselves for its complete acceptance. Across the medieval world, the largest armies ever assembled watched as warriors in white and red robes advanced on their positions. And what they felt was not anger, pride, or even determination. They felt panic, true physical panic, the kind of panic that makes trained soldiers forget their commands and feel their legs refuse to move. And this was not the only legendary moment of exaggerated history. This happened again and again for almost 2 centuries on some of the bloodiest battlefields humanity has ever seen. The real question is not only who these men were, but how an ordinary man could become so terrifying. How did an order of warrior monks create such a reputation that entire armies preferred to change their route rather than risk encountering them? After all, this was not propaganda created after their deaths, and it was not mythology concocted by fans. Their reputation was earned slowly, brutally, scar by scar, in places where even the slightest mistake could mean instant death. The answer lies in what most people misunderstand about the Templars. They were not just elite soldiers or exceptionally disciplined knights. They were the result of a system designed with almost inhuman precision, intended to create the most effective and psychologically invincible warriors the medieval world had ever seen. A system that attacked fear itself at its source and eradicated it before it could develop. But to understand why this system worked, we need to go back long before the first Templar appeared. We need to understand the world that spawned them. Europe in the 10th century was not romantic or heroic. It was brutal, fragmented, and unstable. Feudal lords waged endless private wars. Alliances constantly shifted, and violence was so commonplace it often resembled entertainment rather than necessity. Knights, despite later legends, were often little more than mercenaries with titles, men selling their swords to whoever could pay, guided by codes of honor that easily changed when survival or profit demanded. Warfare was chaotic, personal, and unpredictable. Then, everything changed in 1095. Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd in Clermont, France, and delivered one of the most explosive speeches of the medieval era. He told the European nobility that Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, was under Islamic control. He claimed that pilgrims were being attacked, holy sites desecrated, and that God himself demanded action. Whether it was exaggerated or not, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. What followed became known as the First Crusade, a mass human movement of nobles, peasants, monks, adventurers, and even criminals who were promised spiritual absolution. They marched east, driven by a volatile mix of true religious devotion and unchecked violence. Against almost all expectations, they captured Jerusalem in 1099. However, victory was accompanied by unimaginable brutality. Shocking even to contemporary chroniclers accustomed to war, but conquering Jerusalem proved to be the easy part. Holding it was quite another matter. The Holy Land was not a pacified territory. It remained surrounded by powerful Islamic states determined to reclaim it. Meanwhile, thousands of European pilgrims began traveling dangerous routes to visit the holy sites, completely unprotected. The roads were rife with bandits, brigands, and opportunistic warlords. Travelers were robbed, kidnapped, tortured, or murdered so frequently that pilgrimage had effectively become a gamble with death. Out of this chaos emerged an idea that initially seemed almost absurd. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugh de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an unusual proposition. He and his 8 companions wanted to form a brotherhood, unlike anything that had existed before. Men who would be both monks and warriors, soldiers sworn not to wealth or conquest, but to protecting pilgrims and guarding the sacred roads. They would live under strict religious discipline while fighting as professional soldiers. Baldwin ruled a fragile kingdom perpetually short of men, so he agreed. He granted them quarters in the former stables near what was believed to be Solomon's temple, hence their name, the Poor Knights of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, or the Templars. In its infancy, this legendary order consisted of just 9 men, patrolling dusty roads in hostile territory, sleeping in converted stables beneath ruins they considered sacred. Yet, from the very beginning, they represented something entirely new. They were neither fully monks nor pure warriors. This was an unprecedented experiment, an attempt to merge spiritual fervor with organized violence, which gave rise to a colossal theological dilemma. Medieval Christianity considered killing, even in war, dangerous to the soul. Soldiers returning from campaigns often experienced deep guilt and had to perform acts of penance for the lives they had taken. Society needed warriors, but war was ruining the souls of those who fought. The Templars resolved this contradiction in a revolutionary way. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the time, wrote a text called In Praise of the New Knighthood, specifically to defend them. In it, he introduced a radical idea. Killing an enemy of the faith was not the killing of a man, but a misdeed, a malicidium, the slaying of evil itself. Violence committed in defense of Christianity was considered not sinful, but virtuous, even holy. With this argument, Bernard lifted the psychological burden that weighed down medieval soldiers. A Templar no longer fought fearing spiritual damnation. Every battle became an act of piety. Killing did not require subsequent confession, and death in combat was not a tragedy, but immediate martyrdom, a direct path to salvation. This transformed the psyche of the Templar knight in a way few armies could comprehend. The fear on the battlefield almost always stems from one source: the instinct for self-preservation. Most medieval armies fought effectively only until losses became significant or defeat seemed inevitable. At that point, survival calculations began, cohesion broke down, and a retreat followed. The Templars operated on entirely different principles. For them, death was not the worst outcome. The true failure was abandoning their brothers or retreating without orders. Death meant liberation. Cowardice meant eternal damnation, and this belief was not symbolic rhetoric. It was inscribed directly into their rules with merciless precision. In 1128, at the Council of Troyes, the order's rule codified every aspect of their existence, from daily duties to battlefield conduct. These rules formed the basis of one of the most disciplined fighting forces in history. The combat rules laid out in the Templar Code had no parallel in medieval warfare, and they explain why enemies so often described them as unstoppable. A Templar knight was forbidden to retreat unless the enemy's forces outnumbered his own by at least 3-1, 3 enemies for every Templar. This was the minimum threshold. Before a retreat could even be considered acceptable, anything less meant continued combat was not bravery, but duty. Retreating without explicit permission from a superior resulted in immediate expulsion from the order, and for a Templar, expulsion was worse than death itself. Losing membership meant simultaneously losing identity, purpose, salvation, and brotherhood. But what made the order truly exceptional was not just how its members were trained to fight or die, it was how they were expected to live every day. The Templar lifestyle functioned almost as a long-term psychological training program, designed a century before psychology became a science. Their day began before sunrise, entirely structured around the canonical hours of prayer: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. 8 collective prayer times divided the day into strict segments that excluded idleness. Between prayers followed physical training, weapons maintenance, horse care, construction work, patrolling, and public service. There was no lost time, no boredom, and very little opportunity for distraction or indulgence. Wine consumption was carefully rationed. Meat was eaten only a few times a week and strictly for sustenance, not pleasure. During meals, silence was mandatory until sacred texts were read aloud. Personal wealth was completely forbidden. A Templar owned nothing individually. No land, no jewels, no money, not even personal equipment. Everything belonged to the order. This rule eliminated one of the strongest psychological drivers of fear in combat: attachment to possessions. A knight who owned estates, titles, or a family fortune had something material to lose. A Templar had no such thing. The blessed property of survival was no longer tied to earthly security. Their lives were measured spiritually, not materially, which fundamentally distinguished them from feudal knights or mercenaries fighting for profit or inheritance. Their equipment itself became another crucial advantage. In most medieval armies, the quality of armor, weapons, and horses depended entirely on personal wealth. Some knights entered battle superbly equipped, while others fought with inferior gear simply because they could afford nothing better. The Templars eliminated this disparity through centralized logistics. The order maintained an extensive network of workshops, forges, stables, and supply depots across its territories, ensuring every knight went into battle with reliable equipment, maintained to a single standard. A Templar did not go into battle with damaged armor or a weakened horse. Their weapons were sharpened, their gear repaired, and their animal was in excellent physical condition under constant supervision. The warhorse, in turn, deserves special mention. The medieval destrier was not merely a means of transport. It was a kind of weapon, comparable to an armored battering ram a century before gunpowder weapons. These animals were characterized by their massive build, power, and specialized training that allowed them to remain calm amidst the cries of soldiers, the clash of steel, and the general chaos. Controlled mainly by the pressure of the knees and subtle movements, the horse allowed its rider to wield weapons with both hands in combat. Training such an animal required years of investment, specialized breeding, and constant care. Individual knights generally found it difficult to maintain war horses due to the high cost. However, the Templars used collective breeding and maintenance systems, ensuring consistent quality. Their squires and serving brothers spent hours daily feeding, grooming, and training these animals. The result of their work was devastating when the horses were deployed in battle. The charge of Templar cavalry was technically different from ordinary knightly raids. The order's rule required maintaining a tight formation, a compact wedge designed to concentrate striking power and minimize vulnerabilities. Instead of attacking individually in pursuit of glory, they moved as a single striking force. When this formation crashed into infantry ranks, the psychological and physical impact was often catastrophic. It was not supernatural strength that shattered enemy lines, but disciplined cohesion combined with trained horses and riders who refused to slow down, even under extreme pressure. Many opposing armies took years to fully understand why a Templar assault was so difficult to stop. Traditional battlefield logic assumed that soldiers would eventually retreat when losses mounted or an enemy tactical advantage became clear. Experienced commanders counted on provoking panic or a controlled withdrawal to destroy the enemy during their retreat. Against the Templars, this expectation repeatedly failed. They did not react predictably because their decision-making system rejected survival-based logic. Even when military considerations suggested retreat, their rule required continuing the fight unless there was a direct order otherwise. This generated an unsettling unpredictability. Commanders facing them could not determine when their morale would break, because often, it simply didn't. Contemporary military chronicles repeatedly mentioned another powerful element contributing to this effect: the Templar banner, known as the Baussant. The black and white standard had a specific operational significance beyond symbolism. The standard bearer was given strict orders to keep it raised regardless of circumstances. If he was wounded or killed, another brother immediately took his place. The banner functioned as a mobile command post and a rallying point. As long as it stood, no Templar knight could retreat on their own. Every member of the order was expected to move towards it, regroup, and continue fighting. In the chaotic environment of medieval warfare, where communication often broke down within minutes, this system created automatic cohesion. Even when formations disintegrated or commanders vanished from view, the banner provided orientation and unity for enemies watching from the opposite side of the battlefield. The sight was profoundly disturbing. When logic dictated that resistance should have ended, the black and white standard still flew, signaling a resilience beyond ordinary human capacity. It suggested that the forces advancing on them operated by rules fundamentally different from those governing conventional armies. Discipline extended beyond combat to areas that medieval commanders rarely considered strategically important, including hygiene and the maintenance of daily order. The Templars adhered to detailed rules concerning cleanliness, clothing care, and sanitation in their commanderies. While they lacked modern medical knowledge, these practices reduced illness rates compared to irregular troops living in unsanitary conditions. Fewer sick meant greater operational readiness. Armies that were healthier, better supplied, and mentally resilient accumulated advantages rarely described in dramatic chronicles but crucial over time. Battles were often decided long before swords crossed, thanks to logistics, discipline, and preparation. The order's recruitment system further reinforced this mechanism. Entry into the order was intentionally arduous. Candidates faced interrogation before a full assembly of brothers. They were questioned about debts, marital status, health, obligations, and prior attachments. They were explicitly warned about the life that awaited them: absolute obedience, the forfeiture of personal freedom, strict asceticism, an uncompromising routine, and the high probability of violent death in foreign lands. This is what awaited contenders. Future members of the order were made to understand that they would sleep only by command, fast when required, cross seas without objection, and engage in battles that any sensible man would voluntarily shun. The induction ceremony served as a form of selection, a psychological filter. Those who agreed after being presented with these harsh realities were not naive romantics seeking glory. They were individuals who had consciously chosen a path of self-sacrifice. This approach fostered an extraordinary unity of purpose, rarely achieved in armies formed from feudal obligation or economic need. Their loyalty was voluntary and reinforced daily by rituals and discipline. By the mid-10th century, this combination of belief, structure, equipment, and careful selection had transformed a small brotherhood into one of the most effective military organizations of the Middle Ages. Their opponents were not weak or disorganized formations. They faced sophisticated adversaries such as Seljuk forces, Fatimid armies, and later the formidable Ayyubid state led by Saladin, one of history's greatest commanders. Yet, even these experienced enemies noticed something unusual about the Templars long before fully comprehending the reason for their exceptional resilience. Saladin, recognized as one of the medieval world's foremost military strategists, understood warfare perhaps better than anyone else of his era. He repeatedly defeated Crusader armies and, in 1187, achieved one of the most decisive victories in medieval history at the Battle of Hattin. This event ultimately allowed him to recapture Jerusalem. However, Saladin treated the Templars differently from all other opponents he encountered. While ordinary prisoners of war were often ransomed, enslaved, or incorporated into new service depending on their value, captured Templars faced a very different fate. Saladin ordered them to be executed immediately. This decision was not driven by cruelty or unbridled hatred. On the contrary, contemporaries consistently described Saladin as relatively merciful towards his vanquished opponents. His policy towards the Templars was a strategic calculation. A living Templar, even in chains, remained dangerous. He could organize resistance among prisoners, inspire rebellion, attempt escape, or eventually return to the fight through exchange. Unlike many knights, Templars did not negotiate personal ransoms, and the order rarely prioritized individual salvation through payment. Keeping them alive created risk without economic benefit. Their elimination permanently removed a future threat. The fact that such a commander arrived at this conclusion shows how opposing forces assessed the order. They were feared not just for brutality, but for reliability. An enemy who continues to resist even after defeat becomes exceptionally difficult to manage. When opponents prefer to kill you rather than imprison you because imprisonment itself does not neutralize you, a reputation reaches extraordinary levels. But military success alone is insufficient to explain how the Templars maintained their effectiveness for nearly 2 centuries. Behind every charge and every fortress defense stood an organizational structure far ahead of its time. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the order created an extensive logistical network stretching across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Commanderies operated in France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and beyond, serving simultaneously as recruitment centers, financial hubs, agricultural estates, and supply depots. Resources gathered in the peaceful European territories funded and supplied military operations over 1,000 kilometers away in the Holy Land. Grain harvested in Western Europe could sustain garrisons protecting frontier castles in Palestine. Horses bred in one region replenished losses in another. Information flowed through established channels faster than most feudal kingdoms could coordinate internally. This integration created something remarkably modern, a transcontinental system of military support, linking front lines and rear infrastructure. Feudal armies typically relied on ad hoc levies and fragmented noble cooperation. The Templars operated continuously. Their castles in the Holy Land, such as Safed, Chastelblanc, and other fortified citadels, were not isolated defensive positions but interconnected nodes in a strategic network. Each fortress supported patrol routes, supply distribution, and regional intelligence. Capturing one required colossal resources, prolonged sieges, and unwavering commitment that few enemies could afford indefinitely. Meanwhile, nearby Templar positions continued to operate, projecting influence over the surrounding territory. Control was maintained even during sieges through mobility and coordination. Over time, This system multiplied the effectiveness of a relatively small number of knights, but perhaps the Templars' most potent weapon was something intangible: their reputation itself. Medieval warfare largely depended on morale and perception. Troops would often disintegrate even before a physical defeat once confidence waned. Stories of Templar resilience spread widely among both Christian and Muslim forces. Chroniclers describe charges continuing despite overwhelming enemy superiority. Defenses holding long after survival seemed impossible, and disciplined formations refusing to break under pressure that shattered ordinary troops. Whether every story was perfectly accurate mattered less than the overall psychological effect. Opponents entered battle already expecting extraordinary resistance. Fear alters decision-making long before combat begins. Commanders hesitate, soldiers anticipate losses. The momentum shifts subtly, but decisively. The white mantle with the red cross became more than just a badge of identification. It transformed into a symbol associated with relentless persistence. It's important to note that the Templars themselves did not aim to cultivate terror. Their internal writings emphasize obedience, devotion, and faith, not intimidation. They sought loyalty, not glory. Yet, the outcome remained the same. Decades of consistency transformed discipline into legend. Each successful engagement reinforced expectations, and expectations reshaped future encounters. Even defeats contributed to the myth, because the Templars often fought to complete annihilation rather than retreat. Such behavior baffled opponents accustomed to negotiation, surrender, or tactical withdrawal. To medieval observers, this behavior seemed almost inhuman. Another underestimated factor contributing to their endurance was the internal equality within their hierarchy. Although ranks existed, knights, sergeants, serving brothers, all members lived by the common rules of poverty and obedience. Noble birth exempted no one from discipline. A commander slept by the same rules as ordinary brothers. This reduced the internal discontent common in feudal armies, where privilege divided leaders and soldiers. Shared hardship fostered cohesion when men believed their leaders were making the same sacrifices. Loyalty deepened naturally. Clarity in communication and command further enhanced effectiveness. Orders were passed down through clearly defined chains, reducing confusion during combat. Coupled with the unifying function of the battle standard, this structure allowed units to regain organization even amidst the chaos of battle. Medieval battles often devolved into fragmented skirmishes once formations broke. Templar units displayed remarkable resilience in re-establishing order, because procedures were constantly practiced in daily life, not improvised under pressure. Routine fostered instinctive reactions. Training went beyond weapons proficiency, encompassing emotional control. The constant cycles of prayer reinforced mental stability through repetition and collective identity. Modern observers might describe this as cognitive conditioning. Anxiety is reduced when individuals interpret danger through a shared meaning. For the Templars, battle was not perceived as a random struggle for survival, but as the fulfillment of a sacred duty. This reframing fundamentally altered their response to stress. Fear did not disappear entirely. No man becomes impervious, but its influence was sufficiently lessened to maintain coordinated action. Meanwhile, their opponents remained formidable fighting forces, and Ayyubid and Seljuk commanders adapted tactics, using mobility, missile fire, and attrition strategies specifically designed to counter heavy cavalry. Battles against the Templars were rarely simple victories. Losses occurred, sometimes significant. However, the order system allowed for faster recovery than many rivals expected. New recruits flowed in through European networks. Equipment shortages were resolved through centralized supply. Institutional continuity mattered more than individual survival. The death of a knight did not dismantle the structure supporting him for generations. It created the impression that the order itself could not be truly depleted. Individuals perished, but the machine kept functioning. By the late 11th century, enemies facing Crusader forces increasingly distinguished between ordinary contingents and Templar formations. Chronicles noted instances where opposing troops adjusted plans specifically to avoid direct engagement with them, unless numerical superiority was overwhelming. Strategic caution itself was a testament to their impact. Warfare is shaped by both avoidance and confrontation. When an army changes its movement pattern simply to reduce the probability of encountering a specific unit, this unit had achieved strategic deterrence. All these elements, theology eliminating spiritual wavering, disciplined daily structure, standardized equipment, selective recruitment, integrated logistics, collective identity, and accumulated reputation coalesced into a single operational reality. The Templar Knight going into battle demonstrated not just his own courage, but the output of a cohesive institutional system, honed by years of experience. He fought differently because every aspect of his life before battle was calculated to ensure predictable resilience under extreme pressure. Astonishing observers accustomed to armies driven by wealth, fealty to lords, or temporary obligations, this consistency seemed alien, and this perception long defined the Order's legacy as individual battles faded from memory. By the time the Templar Order reached its zenith of power, it had far surpassed the humble brotherhood of 9 men who guarded the pilgrim routes. What began as a defensive initiative gradually transformed into one of medieval Europe's most influential organizations. It combined military might, religious authority, economic innovation, and administrative efficiency in a way no one had previously attempted. Their battlefield successes bred trust, and trust opened doors leading far beyond warfare. Kings, nobles, and pilgrims began entrusting the Order with duties entirely unrelated to combat. Because the Templars took vows of poverty and obedience, they were perceived as incorruptible, compared to feudal lords driven by inheritance or ambition. Over time, this perception allowed them to create something revolutionary, a financial network operating across continents. Pilgrims traveling from Europe to the Holy Land no longer needed to carry dangerous volumes of gold along bandit-infested roads. Instead, they could deposit funds at a Templar commandery in one country and withdraw equivalent sums elsewhere using coded documents. In practice, the Order laid the foundations for an early form of international banking centuries before modern financial systems emerged. Wealth moved securely, without the physical transport of treasure. This innovation significantly increased pilgrim traffic and bolstered the Order's financial independence. Commanderies across Europe became centers of agriculture, trade, and administration. Land donations from grateful nobles rapidly expanded their holdings. Farms, vineyards, mills, and ports provided a steady income that supported military operations across the sea. Unlike feudal armies dependent on seasonal campaigns, the Templars operated continuously, as their financing relied on more than just taxes or plunder. Their economic stability allowed for long-term planning, rarely achievable in medieval warfare. However, prosperity also brought new risks. Success made them powerful, and power inevitably attracted suspicion. The Order answered directly to the Pope, not local rulers, giving it an autonomy that bypassed traditional political hierarchies. In many regions, Templar holdings were exempt from taxes and local control. For monarchs seeking to consolidate centralized power, an international organization controlling land, wealth, fortresses, and trained warriors represented both a valuable asset and a potential threat. Nevertheless, for much of the 10th and early 11th centuries, their military role remained paramount. The Holy Land demanded constant defense, and Templar strongholds served as anchor points, preventing rapid territorial collapse. Their castles were masterpieces of military engineering, designed not merely to withstand attack but to dominate the surrounding terrain. Thick concentric walls, towering keeps, controlled entry points, and internal supply systems allowed defenders to withstand lengthy sieges. These fortresses projected both psychological and tactical power. Approaching such a fortress meant months or even years of costly operations. Enemy commanders often preferred maneuver warfare over direct confrontation, simply to avoid being drawn into protracted sieges that drained manpower and resources. Within these strongholds, daily life followed the same disciplined rhythm as elsewhere in the Order. Prayer structured time, maintenance of property never ceased, weapons were constantly repaired, horses trained, defensive structures inspected, and preparation became continuous, not reactive. The result was a readiness rarely dependent on warning. When attacks occurred, garrisons responded with immediate alacrity because preparation never stopped. However, the strategic landscape around the Crusader states gradually shifted. Muslim forces consolidated under increasingly capable leadership, coordinating campaigns more effectively than their earlier fragmented rivals. Victories that had once temporarily secured territories became harder to hold. Even the Templar system could not fully compensate for the demographic and geographic disadvantages faced by Crusader settlements far from European reinforcement bases. Losses slowly mounted, castles changed hands, supply lines became more vulnerable, The fall of key strongholds weakened the interconnected network that sustained the Christian presence in the region. The decisive turning point came with the gradual collapse of Crusader rule in the late 11th century. In 1291, the fall of Acre, the last significant Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, marked the de facto end of sustained Christian military presence in the region. The Knights Templar fought among the last defenders, holding their positions until evacuation became impossible. The survivors retreated to Cyprus, bringing with them not only combat experience but an institutional identity suddenly stripped of its original purpose. With no Holy Land left to defend, the order faced an existential question. What role remained for warrior monks when the battlefield justifying their existence had vanished? Returning to Europe, public opinion began to shift. The very independence that had once made the Templars effective now seemed alarming. They possessed wealth without apparent military necessity, fortresses without ongoing crusades, and international influence that extended beyond direct royal control. Rumors spread easily in medieval societies shaped by limited information and political rivalries. Accusations, misunderstandings, and resentments quietly accumulated beneath the surface. One ruler in particular viewed the order with a different lens. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted after costly wars and administrative reforms, faced severe financial pressure. Meanwhile, the Templars possessed considerable resources within his kingdom, remaining legally independent of his authority. In 1307, events unfolded with shocking speed. On Friday, October 13th, royal officials across France simultaneously arrested members of the Templar order under secretly issued orders. Accusations ranged from heresy and corruption to strange ritualistic practices. Under intense interrogation, often with coercion, confessions were obtained that more readily supported political aims than verified truth. The sudden collapse of an institution that had dominated medieval warfare for nearly 2 centuries sent shockwaves through Europe. The trials dragged on for years, intertwined with complex negotiations between the monarchy and the papacy. Ultimately, under immense political pressure, Pope Clement V dissolved the order in 1312. Its last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was executed in 1314, marking the symbolic end of the Templars as an official institution. However, the destruction of the organization did not erase what it had created. The Templars left behind more than just castles or financial systems. They demonstrated that discipline, structure, shared belief, logistical coordination, and psychological conditioning could transform relatively small forces into entities capable of influencing entire regions. Their legacy survived not through continued existence, but through emulation. Later military orders, standing armies, and centralized institutions adopted principles first pioneered by the Templars: standardized training, continuous funding, hierarchical command, and integrated logistical networks. Even modern professional militaries unknowingly echo concepts developed centuries ago. The paradox of the Templars is this: they disappeared not because they were militarily defeated, they disappeared because their success altered the political balance around them. An organization created to defend the faith ultimately became too powerful to comfortably exist within nascent centralized states. And yet, long after the arrests and executions brought the order to an end, stories about them continued to live on. Chroniclers remembered not bankers or administrators, but knights in white cloaks, advancing without hesitation. Memory preserved an image forged on battlefields, of men who seemed beyond fear because their entire lives had been arranged to eliminate it. Ultimately, what made the Templars exceptional was never a single battle, a legendary charge, or even their immense wealth. It was the system they built, and the consistency with which that system shaped human behavior for generations. Medieval warfare was typically defined by unpredictability. Alliances shifted, soldiers deserted, morale collapsed, and victories often depended as much on luck as strategy. The Templars represented the opposite. They undertook something radically different for their time, turning warfare into a controlled environment, governed by discipline, faith, and structure, rather than emotion or personal ambition. Every element of their existence contributed to the same outcome. Prayer fostered obedience, poverty eliminated distraction, training built instinct. Brotherhood replaced individuality, logistics ensured readiness. For decades, these layers combined to produce fighters whose reactions under pressure were fundamentally different from those of ordinary soldiers. When fear arose, as it always does in combat, The Templars' response was already rehearsed thousands of times through ritual and routine. Continue to advance, remain under the banner, uphold the charter, defend your brothers. Individuality dissolved into the system, and this dissolution became their greatest strength to observing enemies on the battlefield. Such stability seemed unnatural. Medieval armies expected a breaking point, the moment when self-preservation instinct would override discipline. For the Templars, this often never came. Attacks continued longer than usual. Defenses held beyond reason. Units regrouped when others had already scattered. Over time, opponents began to perceive this reliability as fearlessness, and fearlessness quickly morphed into myth. But the truth was more complex. The Templars were not immune to fear. They simply belonged to an organization designed to prevent fear from having authority over decision-making. Their valor was a product of structure, not spontaneous impulse. And this distinction explains why their reputation endured even after their destruction. For reputations based on isolated acts of heroism fade quickly, whereas reputations built on systemic consistency live on in memory long after individual actors have vanished. Even their demise contributed to the legend. The sudden arrests, dramatic trials and executions of leaders transformed the order from a military organization into a historical enigma. The gaps left by incomplete records were filled with narratives. Some imagined hidden treasures, secret knowledge, or clandestine survival. However, for the true legacy, no conspiracies were necessary. The Templars' real achievements were already visible in the subsequent transformation of medieval institutions. European monarchies increasingly adopted standing administrative systems. Armies evolved from ad hoc feudal levies to year-round standing professional forces. Financial management became centralized. Communication networks improved. Many of these changes mirrored practices demonstrated by the Templars decades earlier. History rarely progresses through sudden inventions. It evolves through the emulation of what proves effective. The order showed that loyalty could be institutional, not personal. That war could be sustained by an organization, not seasonal enthusiasm, and that psychological cohesion could matter as much as numbers or weaponry. Long after the Crusader states vanished, these lessons remained an integral part of developing European powers. And perhaps this explains why the image of the Templar Knight continues to resonate centuries later, not due to secrecy or hidden relics, but because they represent an enduring question about human limits. What happens when faith, discipline, and purpose perfectly align? How far can ordinary people go when fear lost its central role in decision-making? The men wearing white cloaks with red crosses did not consider themselves legends. They woke before dawn, prayed, trained, repaired equipment, followed orders, and repeated the same actions day after day in harsh conditions. Their goal was not glory, but fidelity. Yet, repetition turned devotion into effectiveness, and effectiveness into reputation. For nearly 200 years, armies that saw this distinctive formation approaching did not immediately ask how to defeat it. They asked how to survive. This reaction was born not from myth, but from accumulated experience, repeated across generations of warfare. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms changed borders. Political alliances shifted endlessly. But the memory of a force that proved unwilling to break, even when logic dictated surrender, persisted. In a world where most soldiers fought because circumstances compelled them, the Templars consciously chose their path and renewed that choice every day. And that choice, repeated in prayer halls, on training grounds, within fortress walls, and on battlefields, created something rare in history. A military order whose greatest weapon was not steel or cavalry, but belief embodied in action. When people today envision medieval wars, they often see chaos and individual heroism. However, the story of the Templars reveals a different reality. Organization can overcome disorder. Shared meaning can stabilize fear. Systems can alter human behavior so profoundly that opponents perceive ordinary men as something superhuman. The white and red cavalry wedge advancing across dusty plains became terrifying, not because it was unstoppable, but because it represented predictability in a brutal world defined by uncertainty. And in that, perhaps, lies their most enduring lesson. The Templars conquered fear not by eliminating danger. They conquered it by redefining men's understanding of danger itself. Death lost its power when interpreted as fulfillment, not defeat. Retreat lost its legitimacy when loyalty outweighed survival. Through faith, reinforced by structure, They altered the psychological equation of combat. This transformation echoes quietly through history, wherever disciplined institutions replaced chaos with purpose. Ultimately, the order vanished. The order's castles were redistributed, its assets dispersed, and its members either scattered or executed. Yet, the idea itself lived on. The thought that men, united by common beliefs and unwavering discipline, could become far more potent than their numbers alone might suggest. This is why, even centuries later, their image does not fade. Riders in white and red steadily advance, while opposing troops hesitate, realizing too late that what approaches is not just another band of warriors, but the product of a system designed for unwavering resolve where others were destined to fail. Yeah, based on this story, please adapt the story into English, without changing the core content, in standard, complete, and grammatically correct English, without omitting any content, with a length equivalent to the original, including everything, without summarization.